1607. An English fort is built at the mouth of the James River in what would become the state of Virginia. This is where our story begins, with the establishment of Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. But this is not the beginning of the story. Long before this moment, the land had been home to the Powhatan people for centuries. And when the English arrived, they encountered a complex web of indigenous societies that would profoundly shape their fate. Over the next 150 years, 13 distinct colonies would emerge across the eastern coast of North America. Each of these colonies would have its own unique story to tell. But all of them were united by their shared history and their relationship with England. In this series, we will explore the colonial period of American history from 1607 to 1763. Focusing on how these 13 distinct colonies developed, we'll examine the key events, people, and ideas that shaped their identity and consider how the indigenous peoples and the colonists interacted, competed, and conflicted with one another. Our journey begins in the early 17th century with the establishment of the first colonies in North America. As European powers sought to expand their influence and wealth, they turned their attention to the New World. The Spanish had already established colonies in the Caribbean and Central America, and the French were exploring and trading along the St. Lawrence River in Canada. But it was the English who had established the first permanent English settlement in North America at Jamestown in 1607. The Virginia Company, a joint stock company chartered by King James I of England, undertook this venture with the goal of finding gold, converting indigenous peoples to Christianity, and advancing England's power and wealth. However, the reality was far different than the English had imagined. The colony faced numerous hardships, including disease, starvation, and conflict with local indigenous tribes. But despite these challenges, Jamestown survived and became the foundation for the colony of Virginia. As the colonies began to grow, so did the need for labor. Initially, the English colonists relied on indentured servitude, a system in which individuals, often poor or in debt, would work for a set period of time in exchange for their freedom and sometimes land. This system, however, proved to be unsustainable, leading to the introduction of African slaves into the colonies. The transatlantic slave trade would have a profound impact on the colonies, shaping their economies, societies, and ultimately their paths to independence. The southern colonies of Virginia and North Carolina developed a plantation economy based on cash crops such as tobacco, rice, and indigo. Large tracts of land were cleared and cultivated, and a strict social hierarchy emerged with wealthy planters at the top, followed by small farmers, artisans, and then enslaved Africans at the bottom. Meanwhile, in the middle colonies of New York, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, a more diverse economy took root. While agriculture was important, so was trade and commerce, and cities like New York City and Philadelphia became centers of economic activity. Religious tolerance was also more prevalent in these colonies, attracting settlers from various European backgrounds, including Puritans, Quakers, and Catholics. As the colonies grew, so did their populations. People came to the colonies for a variety of reasons, including religious freedom, economic opportunity, and a desire for a better life. Many of the early settlers were Puritans who sought to escape religious persecution in England. Others were simply looking for a fresh start or an opportunity to own land that was scarce in England. As the colonies developed, they began to face challenges from the other European powers that had colonies in North America. The French, Dutch, and Spanish all posed potential threats, and the colonists had to work to defend their settlements. Additionally, the colonies were still dependent on England for many things, including military protection, and they had to carefully balance their relationship with their colonial power. Despite these challenges, the 13 colonies continued to grow and develop. They each had their own unique character and identity, and they began to forge a sense of unity among themselves as they shared experiences and challenges. By the mid-18th century, the colonies were on a path toward independence. A series of events, including the French and Indian War and the growing tensions with Britain over issues such as taxation without representation, would ultimately lead to the American Revolution and the creation of the United States of America. Throughout this period, the interaction between the European colonists and the indigenous peoples of North America was complex and multifaceted. Initially, the colonists and indigenous peoples engaged in trade and diplomacy, exchanging goods and forming alliances. However, as the colonies expanded, conflicts over land and resources arose, leading to increased tensions and violence. The colonists' encroachment on indigenous lands, their introduction of new diseases, and their efforts to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity caused significant disruption to Native American cultures and ways of life. Despite these challenges, some indigenous leaders and communities found ways to adapt and resist, forging alliances with other tribes and even engaging in diplomacy with the colonial governments. One of the most significant aspects of the colonial period was the development of each colony's distinct identity. The New England colonies of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island were characterized by their strong Puritan influence, which shaped their religious and political life. Education was highly valued in these colonies, and they became centers of intellectual and religious thought. The middle colonies of New York, Pennsylvania, and Delaware were more diverse in their population and more tolerant of different religions, attracting settlers from various European backgrounds. This diversity, along with their geographic location in the middle of the colonial holdings, led to these colonies being known as the breadbasket colonies due to their production of a variety of agricultural products. The southern colonies of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia developed a plantation economy based on cash crops such as tobacco, rice, and indigo. These colonies had a strict social hierarchy and were characterized by the widespread use of slavery. As the colonies grew and developed, they began to interact with each other and with their colonial power, England. Trade networks developed among the colonies, and they began to participate in the larger global economy. However, as England began to exert more control over the colonies, tensions grew, leading to events such as the French and Indian War and the growing debate over issues such as taxation without representation. In the French and Indian War, the last of the great wars between European colonial powers in North America, the British and the French fought for control of the continent. The war had significant implications for the future of the colonies, as it led to increased tensions with Britain and contributed to the growing movement for independence. As the 13 colonies moved closer to independence, each colony had its own path and identity. The British began their colonization efforts in North America in the early 1600s, and we're going to spend this week talking about what that looked like. We're going to talk about the various colonies that they founded, the different motivations for founding those colonies, how those colonies operated, and what happened to them. So let's get started with a bang. Let's go back to 1607 and see the foundation of the very first permanent English settlement in North America. All right. So it's the year 1607, and you are an English settler who is about to arrive in the Virginia colony. Well, you actually call it the Virginia colony because you've named it after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I, even though there's no actual provinces or territories in England yet. Anyways, your ship docks with 104 settlers, and you all step off onto the shore of a marshy, mosquito-ridden island in the middle of the James River. It's not exactly what you had envisioned when you signed on for this voyage. Now, while you're getting settled, you overhear some of the older, more experienced colonists talking about how this spot was chosen. Apparently, the decision to settle here was made back in England by a group of businessmen who called themselves the Virginia Company. They were a joint stock company, which means that people who wanted to invest in the colony but didn't want to actually go to North America themselves could buy shares in the company and then receive a percentage of the profits based on how many shares they owned. The Virginia Company was a royal charter company, meaning that they had been granted this territory by King James I of England. But why did the English want to colonize this area anyways? Back in England, the motivation for colonization varied among the various colonies. Some colonies were motivated by religious freedom, like the Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth in 1620. For others, it was economic opportunity that drove them, like the English desire for gold and other natural resources, or the chance to set up a new trade network. This last group was England's merchant class, and they would form the basis of the colonial elite in North America. The Virginia Company was motivated by a desire for profit. They believed that this land would be rich in gold, silver, and other valuable commodities that they could extract and bring back to England. They also hoped to establish a strong trading presence in the region and control the fur trade. Now, there was already a large population of indigenous peoples living in this area, including the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. But the English saw the natives as a source of cheap labor and believed that they could easily be subjugated. As you finish getting settled, you look around the palisade and see that there isn't much to do. You ask one of the older settlers what the plan is around here, and he tells you that basically everyone is just expected to work until the colony becomes profitable and returns a profit to the investors back in England. Now, these investors are unreally interested in sending more supplies over, unless they know that they go in to make money. And so far, well, it hasn't really looked like the most lucrative opportunity. In fact, as you've walked around the perimeter of the fort, you've seen quite a few bodies lying around, and you haven't even been here an hour. It turns out that this is actually the third settlement the English have attempted to establish in this region, and none of them have worked out. There was one in 1604 that was destroyed by a hurricane, and another one in 1605 that was attacked by the local indigenous people. It's generally been a pretty rough time for the English. You ask if they've considered moving somewhere else, and the settler says something about how the Virginia Company owns all of this land. And so, like it or not, here is where they're going to try and stay. And since the Virginia Company has no intention of funding the colony unless there is a good chance of profit, this will be your life for the foreseeable future. This area proved to be difficult for the English to adapt to. They had no experience with the hot, humid climate and the abundance of mosquitoes and snakes. Food was also scarce, as there was little fertile land for farming, and hunting was difficult due to conflicts with the Powhatan Confederacy. During the winter of 1609 to 1610, only 60 of the 500 colonists survived, a period known as the starving time. While many settlers perished, a few notable figures emerged. One was Captain John Smith, whose leadership and strict discipline helped maintain order during the colony's darkest days. Another was John Rolfe, who successfully cultivated tobacco, a highly profitable cash crop that saved the colony and established Virginia as a major agricultural economy. Rolfe's introduction of tobacco led to the development of large plantations worked by enslaved Africans, shaping the colony's future. So, as we wrap up this episode, we gonna go ahead and leave you here in 1610. UV survived the starving time, and the colony is starting to rebuild. You can probably expect things to get better. Tobacco is growing well and seems to be a very viable cash crop. The colony has a strong leader in Captain John Smith, and overall, things are looking up. But as we all know, that's not really the case. Captain John Smith gets injured in an explosion and leaves the colony, and then the Powhatan Confederacy attacks the colony and begins a series of attacks that will continue for the next 10 years. And in this video, we're going to look at how Southern colonies grew in population and wealth between 1607 and 1763, which is our time period for colonial American history. Okay, so let's begin with what you need to know about these colonies. First off, there are 5 colonies that we can classify as Southern colonies: Virginia, Maryland, the North Carolina colony, which later became 2 colonies, the Carolinas, and finally, Georgia. Now, all of these colonies were founded during our time period, except for Virginia, which was founded in 1607. So we got to get that one out of the way first. And so we can talk about how the Southern colonies developed in 2 phases. First, we had the development of Virginia and Maryland as representative of the early colonial phase. Then we can look at the Carolinas and Georgia as representative of the later phase of Southern colonial development. Also, if you remember from the last video, each of these colonies had a different and sometimes competing charter from one of the three main colonial charters. And those charters were from either King James I, King Charles I, or King Charles II. But now we have another player in the game, and that would be King George II. And he plays a significant role in the founding of the Carolina colony and the Georgia colony, because he held grant charters for both of those colonies. So let's start with Virginia. So remember, the Virginia Company of London founded the first successful colony in 1607 at Jamestown. But after a few years of struggling to stay alive, they realized that their economic plan was unsustainable, and they needed a cash crop. Now, even though the native peoples had cultivated tobacco before, the colonists did not know how to grow it, so they had to learn from the natives. And once they did, well, boom! They were growing enough tobacco to export to England to turn a tidy profit. Now, this prosperity led to an increase in the population of Virginia. Another thing that happened in Virginia during this time was the introduction of African slavery. And that began in 1619 when a Dutch ship arrived in Virginia carrying 20 Africans who were captured by European slavers. These men were sold to colonists who used them to work on plantations. And that marked the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. But don't worry, we'll talk more about that in Unit 4. For now, just know that by 1660, there were about 1,500 Africans enslaved in Virginia. Then in 1632, King Charles I granted a charter to his cousin, Lord Baltimore, and created the province of Maryland. And Maryland was settled mostly by Catholics fleeing persecution in England. Remember, England was a very Protestant place in this period, and Catholics were routinely persecuted there. And so Maryland offered a place of refuge for them. Lord Baltimore envisioned Maryland as a kind of Catholic haven, and he granted them religious freedom in hopes that people would come there and settle. He also hoped that by offering religious freedom, people of different faiths would be tolerant of one another and violence would be reduced. But unfortunately, that never really happened. Now, much like Virginia, Maryland had an abundance of fertile land, so planters started growing tobacco there too. And that meant they needed lots of labor. And so they turned to the Atlantic slave trade to meet that demand. In fact, by 1664, there were over 10,000 Africans enslaved in Maryland. And also, just like Virginia, land was distributed in Maryland by a governing body. In this case, it was Lord Baltimore. He oversaw the distribution of land in order to attract settlers to his new province. All right, so now let's turn our attention to the Carolina colony. So in 1719, the English king, King George II, granted a charter to a group of 8 English nobles, and he called it the Province of Carolina. Now, unlike Virginia and Maryland, this new colony was a proprietary colony, meaning that rather than being run by the king directly, it was run by these 8 nobles as a kind of private business venture. And so these proprietors set out to make the colony profitable by attracting settlers through offering them generous land grants, if they would come and populate the territory. Now, while the proprietors were hoping for a diverse colony with people of different religions and different social classes, the reality was that the colony was dominated by wealthy landowners. And this is because the proprietors gave most of the good land to their friends, which included a guy named Anthony Ashley Cooper. And he would become the wealthiest man in the South. In fact, his estate was so large that it took up an entire isthmus connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Sound on the eastern side of North Carolina. And the indigenous tribes called this place the Albemarle Sound, but Cooper changed the name to Cape Fear, which is what they called it. So the economy of Carolina was based primarily on agriculture, including wheat, barley, tobacco, and rice. But unlike Virginia and Maryland, rice cultivation required flooded fields to grow properly. And this kind of flooded field was rare in the Piedmont region where the colony was located. So what they did was they looked farther south for places where they could grow rice, and they found it near Charleston. And the climate there was perfect for growing rice. and so a flood of new settlers moved to that area. In addition to rice cultivation, Carolina also became a center for indigo production. Now, indigo is a blue dye that was produced in South Carolina and used in the textile industry. And South Carolina's climate was also ideal for growing indigo. And so that gave Carolina a huge advantage over New England in the textile market. So what this means is that Carolina had a diverse agricultural economy based on rice and indigo and other crops. And that made it significantly wealthier than its northern rival, New England. Finally, let's talk about Georgia. So in 1732, King George II chartered a piece of land to James Oglethorpe, who was a member of Parliament. And Oglethorpe envisioned Georgia as a kind of debtor's colony. That's what he wanted it to be known as. He wanted it to be a haven for debtors who could unpay their debts and were threatened with imprisonment in England. And so Oglethorpe hoped that by giving these debtors land in Georgia, they could start fresh and build a life for themselves without the burden of their debts hanging over them. Now, while this was part of the colony's purpose, it wasn't the primary reason for founding Georgia. And that would be defense. See, at this point, the Spanish had Florida. And England was concerned about French and Spanish expansion into the southern part of North America. And so they wanted to put a buffer colony between the Spanish and the valuable Carolina colony. And Oglethorpe knew that in order to do that, he needed to attract settlers to Georgia. And so he did what any reasonable person would do. He traveled to London and had a meeting with a group of wealthy aristocrats and asked them to donate land to the colony. And they agreed. This meant that the land in Georgia was owned by a few wealthy people. And so it didn't have the same kind of land distribution as other colonies. And since the economy of Georgia was based on farming, there was a lot of competition for the best farmland. And so Oglethorpe attempted to regulate the size of farms to make sure that everyone had access to decent farmland. But Oglethorpe's plan backfired, and the colony descended into chaos. And that led to Oglethorpe resigning as the governor of Georgia in 1743. Now, despite the problems that plagued the colony, Georgia did grow in population. Most of the settlers in Georgia were poor, and they were often drawn to the colony because of the cheap land. Unlike the other southern colonies, most of the settlers in Georgia were not wealthy landowners. The New England Experiment, 162017009rator.com. Steady tone. While Virginia thrived on tobacco and trade. A very different vision of society was taking shape to the north in 1620. A small group of English separatists, later called the Pilgrims, set sail aboard the Mayflower. They were not merchants or adventurers, they were families seeking freedom from religious persecution in England. After weeks at sea, the Mayflower made landfall far north of its intended destination in Virginia. The settlers anchored near Cape Cod and eventually settled in a place they named Plymouth. Faced with the uncertainty of life in a new land, the Pilgrims drafted the Mayflower Compact, an agreement that established a form of self-government based on the will of the majority. This simple document planted a seed that would later grow into the democratic ideals of the United States. The first winter was harsh. Nearly half the settlers perished. But with help from local Native American tribes, including the Wampanoag and the famed Squanto, the Pilgrims learned how to grow corn, fish, and survive in their new environment. Their survival marked the beginning of what became known as the New England Experiment. The Puritans arrived by 1630. Another, larger group arrived, the Puritans. Unlike the Pilgrims, the Puritans did not seek to separate from the Church of England entirely, but rather to purify it from within. Led by John Winthrop, over 1,000 Puritans founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Winthrop's vision was clear. We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. This wasn't just poetic language. Winthrop and his followers believed they were creating a model, Christian society that would inspire reform back in England. Building a new society, Massachusetts Bay grew rapidly. Education became a cornerstone. By 1636, Harvard College was founded to train ministers. Public schools were established to ensure all children could read the Bible. Town meetings became central to local governance. Landowning men gathered to vote on community issues, another seed of American self-rule. Strict moral codes governed daily life, emphasizing hard work, discipline, and religious devotion. Yet, this order came at a cost. The Puritans had little tolerance for dissent. Religious dissent and new colonies, not everyone agreed with the Puritan way. Two notable figures stand out. Roger Williams, a minister who believed in the separation of church and state and fair treatment of Native Americans. Banished from Massachusetts in 1636, he founded Rhode Island as a haven for religious freedom and tolerance. Anne Hutchinson, a devout woman who challenged Puritan clergy and promoted personal religious interpretation. For her radical ideas, she too was exiled, eventually joining Rhode Island. These dissenters shaped a broader cultural legacy. The idea that freedom of conscience was worth protecting even against the majority's will. Native American relations. While the New England colonies initially relied on native alliances, tensions eventually boiled over. The Pequot War 1636-1638 resulted in the near destruction of the Pequot tribe. Later, King Philip's War 1675-1676, led by the Wampanoag chief Metacom, was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history relative to population size. These wars cemented English dominance in New England, but also marked the tragic decline of Native American power in the region. Legacy of the New England experiment. By 1700, New England stood apart from other colonies. Its society valued religious devotion, education, community, law and order, self-government through town meetings, yet its contradictions strict religious control. Versus emerging freedoms foreshadowed future American debates over liberty, authority, and individual rights. Narrator: the New England experiment proved both enduring and imperfect. It offered a vision of what a new society could be rooted in faith, law, and learning, while revealing the challenges of balancing order with freedom. All right, as you can see here, these four colonies make up what we are calling the Middle Colonies: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. But before we get into those colonies individually, you need to understand that this section of the colonies is really kind of a bridge between the North and the South. It takes aspects from each and blends them together. So starting off with geography, the Middle Colonies are located in the temperate zone, which means the weather was more moderate than the South and the growing season was longer than in the North. This leads to an agricultural abundance that makes this region known as the breadbasket of Colonial America. More on that in just a minute. And also, the Middle Colonies were less mountainous than the North and the Southern Colonies. In fact, the Appalachian Mountains didn't even reach into this area. Instead, there were rolling hills and vast river systems like the Hudson River, the Delaware River, and the numerous tributaries of the Great Lakes. These rivers provided water power for the burgeoning industries in the area, and they connected the colonies to the interior of the continent. Like, for example, the Ohio River Valley was accessible from the Delaware River via the Ohio and Erie Canal. Also, unlike the South, which had large plantations worked by enslaved people, the Middle Colonies had smaller farms worked by a family and hired laborers. Now, some of the Southern colonies did have small farms, but over time, the climate and the soil conditions led to huge plantations worked by enslaved labor. The Middle Colonies were the most ethnically and religiously diverse of all the colonies. In fact, you could argue that no other region in world history at this time had such a diverse population. And this was primarily due to two factors. First, the Dutch had established a trading post in modern-day New York early on, and they had attracted many Europeans from various regions, and they brought with them various cultures and ethnicities. The second factor was the founding of Pennsylvania by William Penn in 1681. He intentionally sought to create a haven for Quakers who had been persecuted in England, and he welcomed people of different ethnicities and religions. Now, in terms of the economies of the middle colonies, they were largely commercial. In other words, they sought to exchange goods with other colonies or places. And this led to cities becoming the main centers of population. And the chief exports of the middle colonies were wheat and corn. This earned the middle colonies the nickname of the breadbasket of colonial America. Okay, so now let's look at each of the middle colonies individually. First up is New York. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Dutch had originally founded this colony as a fur trading post called New Amsterdam in 1624. But in 1664, the English took the colony from the Dutch and renamed it New York after the Duke of York. Slavery was common in New York, and about 1/3 of the population were enslaved Africans. There was also a significant amount of indentured servants in the colony. Many of them were transported there after being convicted of crimes in England. New York City itself was a major commercial center. It was the busiest port in colonial America and was involved heavily in the triangular trade. And it was also a hub for domestic and international shipping. And New York merchants played a vital role in supplying goods to the other colonies. They also exported lumber, animal products, and foodstuffs like the famous New York apple pie. Next door to New York was New Jersey. It was originally part of New York, but grew so rapidly that it was granted its own separate province in 1702. William Penn actually tried to buy New Jersey from the Duke of York, so he could turn it into a Quaker haven like Pennsylvania. But when that fell through, the Quakers simply settled on the western side of the colony, while the eastern side developed along the same lines as New York. Like New York, New Jersey had a significant amount of slavery, with about 1/3 of the population being enslaved Africans. Along with that, there was also a large number of indentured servants in the colony. The colony was known for its diverse population. In fact, at one point there were 11 different nationalities living in the colony. Then we come to Pennsylvania. As I mentioned earlier, it was founded by William Penn in 1681 as a haven for Quakers. Penn's plan was to create a well-planned colony with religious freedom, fair treatment of Native Americans, and good government. William Penn actually kept a journal while exploring the lands around the Delaware River, and he noted the abundant wildlife and the beauty of the land. He claimed that when he saw the land, it looked as if it was a country not inhabited. He envisioned his colony as a place where people of different ethnicities and religions could live together in harmony, and he encouraged settlement throughout the interior of the colony. That policy had a significant impact on the settlement patterns of Pennsylvania, and he established a representative government that included elected officials and a legislative body. This was very progressive for the time period. In addition, William Penn attempted to purchase land from the various Native American tribes, and he paid them fairly for the land. The Quakers in general believed in peaceful relations with Native Americans, and they worked to maintain those relationships throughout the colonial period. Of course, other European colonies weren't nearly so nice to the natives. As I mentioned earlier, Pennsylvania was known for its religious freedom. Penn's commitment to tolerance led to the establishment of a haven for various persecuted religious groups like Quakers, Baptists, Catholics, and even Jews. This made the colony a beacon of religious freedom during a time when Europe was marked by intense religious conflicts. And finally, we have the colony of Delaware. Delaware was originally settled by Swedes and Finns along the Delaware River in the early 1630s. It was later sold to the English and became a part of the province of Pennsylvania. The colony was known for its small farms and its diverse population, similar to Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Delaware also had a significant number of enslaved Africans, and the colony participated in the triangular trade. However, slavery was never as widespread or as economically important to Delaware as it was to the southern colonies, and agriculture in Delaware was more diversified than in other middle colonies. While wheat and corn were important, there was also a lot of diversification in crops. For example, Delaware farmers grew tobacco, barley, hemp, flax, cotton, indigo, and a variety of vegetables, and this diversity was partly due to the climate. While Delaware had a longer growing season than the southern colonies, it couldn't support the large plantations that were found in the South. All right, so let us take a minute to bring it all together and see how these colonies compared to the other colonial regions. So in terms of their relationship to Britain, the middle colonies were generally more closely tied to Britain than the southern colonies, and the northern colonies were due to their economic reliance on trade with the mother country. The middle colonies were merchants and shippers and traders, and they relied on manufactured goods from Mabatea. Than the southern colonies and the northern colonies. And the northern colonies were due to their economic. Mabia Ks, Manawa, Mamaba, Mamalake, Maba colonies, Mamama colonies were Samari. My Malamis by my Iquas, my Labo, my Mais by Malai my Mads. But it's it by with us, by Saret, by Wisamal, Likaka Wisayas it I soak it to Pia to the let's it to sick to cut it I to reason to the glide to this to kiwi I'm sick glance up eat it to stit, but the lurp cause get it stick to like that it's the cut a race to conflict less mince and the name what the pay the power they later made me. Britain and they participated heavily in the triangular trade. In terms of their social hierarchy, the middle colonies had a more fluid social structure than the southern colonies. Unlike the South, there weren't as many wealthy planters. But instead, there was a growing middle class of merchants and artisans. And the colonies were also more ethnically diverse than the other colonies, with various Germans, Scots, Irish, Africans, and others settling in the region. In terms of religion, the middle colonies were more diverse than the other colonies as well, with various Protestant denominations, as well as Catholics and Jews practicing their faiths freely. Only Rhode Island had more religious diversity at this point. Politically, the middle colonies were more closely tied to Britain than the southern colonies, but they were still very much aware of their rights as Englishmen. The various colonial legislatures had considerable power, and they worked to protect the interests of the colonists. And finally, in terms of their economy, the middle colonies were known for their agricultural production, particularly wheat and corn. The nickname for the middle colonies was the breadbasket of colonial America. They also had a thriving commercial and industrial sector. Cities like New York City were major centers of trade. Okay. So in the last video, we talked about how European powers established their colonies in North America, and you can watch that here if you need to review. This video is about relations with Native Americans. And since there were lots of Native Americans and many different European colonies, our story is going to focus on the interactions between Europeans and natives throughout all the different regions of colonial America. But remember what we said about the French. Oh yeah. Okay, then let's get started. Okay, so the first thing to know about relations with Native Americans is that it varied by region. So we start in New England, where the first permanent English colony was established at Jamestown, Virginia. But we going to skip over Virginia for now and head up to Massachusetts Bay Colony, because that's where things got interesting with the natives. The Puritans who settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony had a more difficult time adjusting to life in the wilderness and getting along with the natives than their counterparts in Virginia. And this was partly due to geography. The Puritans settled in an area inhabited by many different tribes, including the Pequot, the Wampanoag, and the Mohawk. And unlike the southern colonies, New England had very little fertile land. So the colonists were forced to push into the interior of the continent sooner than they would have liked. So, after the initial period of peace and cooperation between the colonists and the natives ended, the colonists found themselves at war with the Pequot tribe. The Pequot War was fought from 1636 to 1638, and while it was primarily a conflict between two distinct tribes, the Pequot and the Narragansett, it also involved the colonists from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The fighting began when the Pequot killed several colonists, men, women, and children. And the colonists responded by enlisting the help of the rival Narragansett tribe and attacking the Pequot. By the end of the war, nearly every Pequot man, woman, and child was either killed or captured. The war was a disaster for the natives, but it demonstrated the power of the English colonies. With the Pequot out of the way, the English colonies could expand into their lands without interference. But before the memory of the Pequot War faded, another conflict erupted. King Philip's War. It was named after the chief of the Wampanoag tribe, Metacomet, whose English name was King Philip. He was called King Philip because he wanted to be the king of all the native tribes from New England. And he hoped to unite them against the colonists. Now, his goal was not to drive the colonists back into the sea, but to create a buffer zone between the colonists and the natives. But unfortunately, most of the tribes refused to join him, and only a few hundred warriors fought alongside Philip during the war. The colonists learned from their previous mistakes and prepared for this conflict in advance. They built strong fortifications and recruited allies from among the native tribes. As a result, the war lasted only 1 year, from 1675 to 1676, and the colonists were able to defeat King Philip and his followers. Philip was killed, and his head was cut off and hung from a tree as a warning to other would-be rebels. After the war, the Massachusetts government confiscated the lands of natives who had fought against the colonists and divided it among the colonists. Many natives who had not participated in the war were forced to relocate west of the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, so to review. In New England, the Pequot and King Philip's Wars devastated native populations and cemented English dominance. The combination of disease, war, and displacement caused the native population to go from around 100,000 to less than 20,000 by the end of the 17th century. There's also an interesting thing that happened after King Philip's War. Remember? The guy that was in charge of the Massachusetts Bay Colony? The governor. Well, he got charged with mismanaging the war. This is important because it shows that even though the war was fought over 200 years ago, it's still relevant today. Like, people are still prosecuted for crimes committed during wartime. John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts, was charged with mismanaging the war, and he was removed from office. So you can see that even in the early days of the colony, there was a system of checks and balances in place. Let's move down to the middle colonies and talk about Pennsylvania. William Penn, the founder of the colony, wanted to create a haven for Quakers. The Quakers were a religious group that had broken away from the Church of England. They believed in peace and simplicity, and they didn't believe in slavery. When Penn first arrived in North America, he bought land from the natives, the Lenape people. However, as the colony grew, the colonists started to encroach on native lands without permission. This led to several conflicts between the colonists and the natives, but Penn always tried to keep peace between the two groups. One of the things that set Pennsylvania apart from the other colonies was its policy towards Native Americans, while other colonies were pushing Native Americans further and further west. Penn's government tried to maintain peaceful relations with the natives. This was due to the influence of the Quakers, who believed in the equality of all people, regardless of race or religion. The government of Pennsylvania enacted laws that protected the rights of Native Americans, such as the right to own property and the right to due process in court. These laws were some of the first of their kind in North America, and they set an example for other colonies to follow. Unfortunately, these policies did not last forever. As the colony of Pennsylvania grew and developed, the pressure to expand onto Native American lands became too great. The native populations were forced to move west of the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, so let's move down to the southern colonies and talk about the relationship between the colonists and the natives there. Unlike the New England colonies, the southern colonies had plenty of fertile land. The colonists didn't need to expand westward for a long time. For this reason, the southern colonies did not have the same problems with the natives that the New England colonies did. That doesn't mean that there wasn't conflict, however. In the early years of the colony of Virginia, the settlers relied on the help of the Powhatan tribe to survive. The Powhatan were a confederation of small tribes living in the area around the Chesapeake Bay. Chief Powhatan helped the settlers learn how to grow crops in the New World and how to hunt and fish in the area. However, as the colony grew, the relationship between the colonists and the natives became more strained. The colonists began to encroach on native lands, and the two groups eventually went to war. The war between the English colonists and the Powhatan lasted from 1622 to 1623 and resulted in the deaths of hundreds of colonists and natives alike. The war was a turning point in the relationship between the two groups, and it marked the beginning of the end for the natives in Virginia. The colony of Carolina had a similar experience with the natives. The colonists had good relations with the natives at first, but as the colony grew, the two groups came into conflict with each other. The colonists were able to defeat the natives in battle and force them to move further west. In Georgia, the colonists had even more success against the natives. The founder of the colony, James Oglethorpe, wanted to create a buffer zone between the other colonies and the Spanish colony of Florida. Oglethorpe knew that the only way to do this was to remove the natives from the area. The colonists in Georgia used a combination of warfare and diplomacy to achieve this goal. They made alliances with some of the native tribes and used them against their enemies. They also offered the natives the option to convert to Christianity and become civilized or be killed. Many of the natives chose to convert in order to save their lives. Those who refused were killed or forced to move west. Now, let's talk about the impact of European colonization on Native Americans. The arrival of Europeans in North America had a devastating impact on Native Americans. The colonists brought with them diseases that devastated native populations. The natives had no immunity to these diseases, and they were wiped out by the thousands. The natives also suffered greatly from the displacement caused by colonization. As the colonies grew, the natives were forced to move further and further west. This often meant leaving behind their homes and all of their belongings. Many natives died during the forced marches west. Finally, the natives were often killed outright by the colonists. The colonists were determined to expand their territory, and they were willing to do whatever it took to achieve this goal. Despite all of these hardships, the natives did not give up. They fought back against the colonists whenever they could. They also tried to adapt to the changes taking place around them. Some natives adopted European customs and even became Christians, but these efforts were not enough to save them. The colonists continued to push westward, and the natives were eventually forced to flee to the western territories. Now, when most folks think about colonial America, they imagine a bunch of people sailing over on the Mayflower, and then immediately starting a war with the British. But, in fact, a lot happened between those two events. And frankly, if we don't understand what was going on during this time period, it's going to be really difficult to understand why the revolution happened when it did. So, in this video, we look at how life in colonial America changed from 1700 to 1763, and you might be surprised by how much it changed. In 1700, colonial America was home to about 250,000 people, and by 1763, there were over 1 million. Most of these folks were not the poor, desperate, starving immigrants that you see in old colonial propaganda. Basically, between 1700 and 1763, colonial America saw 3 major waves of immigration. First, many more Europeans chose to come to America on purpose instead of being sent here as indentured servants. Second, the transatlantic migration saw many Europeans move from the south of England to the north. And third, thousands upon thousands of slaves were brought from Africa to work on plantations in the south. The result of all this was an explosion of population and diversity in the colonies, which led to the development of distinct regional identities. As we discussed in the last video, New England was still largely rural and centered around small farming communities. In the middle colonies, cities like New York and Philadelphia became hubs of trade and commerce as the population grew. Of course, as we've already established, slavery played a huge role in the Southern economy. And the growth of slavery during this period was exponential. In 1700, there were fewer than 10,000 slaves in the colonies. But by 1763, there were over 200,000. Now, many of these slaves were concentrated in the South, but enslaved people would be found throughout the colonies working in households, on farms, or in businesses. And despite the brutality of slavery, enslaved people created families and communities and resisted their oppression in various ways. We'll talk more about that in another video. Another major change in colonial America between 1700 and 1763 was the Great Awakening. Now, when most folks think about religion in colonial America, they think about Puritans. And that's not totally inaccurate. The Puritans were a major force in New England up until the end of the 17th century. But by the 1730s, they had lost much of their influence as the Great Awakening swept through the colonies. To put it simply, the Great Awakening was a religious revival that emphasized personal faith over church dogma and rituals. And it was a reaction against what many saw as the stale, intellectualized version of Christianity offered by established churches. Think about it like this. Up until the 1730s, if you wanted to go to church in colonial America, you probably had to attend a Puritan service, unless you were an Anglican, and those were pretty boring. You know, no drums and trumpets, just a lot of rules and regulations. The Great Awakening changed all that. The revival began in the 1730s with the arrival of preachers like George Whitefield, who came over from England to tour the colonies. And his sermons were so popular that crowds of up to 30,000 people would show up to hear him speak. And the people loved him because he didn't just talk about Jesus and salvation. He talked about the power of God in a way that connected with everyday people. And this was revolutionary. Like literally. The Great Awakening helped to lay the cultural foundation for questioning authority, whether political, religious, or social. And one preacher in particular embodied this spirit. His name was Jonathan Edwards, and he was a congregational minister from Massachusetts. And his 1738 sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," is considered the quintessential expression of the Great Awakening. Now, in this sermon, Edwards doesn't just preach about hell, he preaches about damnation. He talks about sinners as if they are re-standing on the edge of a volcano that could erupt at any moment. And he uses vivid imagery to evoke fear and repentance. And while some scholars argue that Edwards's rhetoric was excessive and even manipulative, others say that his message was a call for personal responsibility and spiritual renewal. They helped to spark a series of revivals that swept through New England and the Middle Colonies. And these revivals led to the formation of new denominations such as Methodism and Presbyterianism. And while the Great Awakening eventually lost steam, its effects on colonial society were profound. It challenged the authority of established churches. And speaking of upheaval, let's talk about the French and Indian War, because that was also a big deal in the middle of the 18th century. Now, if you know anything about the French and Indian War, you probably know that the French lost and the British won. But what you might not know is that it was a costly victory. The war lasted from 1754 to 1763, and it was fought primarily in North America between the British and the French. And while the conflict was part of a larger global struggle known as the 7 Years' War, it was unique in the sense that it had a profound impact on the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. See, the French had been in North America since the 1600s, and they had established several colonies along the St. Lawrence River and in the Great Lakes region. Meanwhile, the British had colonies in the southern part of the continent, and they were encroaching on French territory. Tensions were high, and in 1754, a skirmish broke out between British and French forces in the Ohio River Valley. This marked the beginning of the French and Indian War. The war was fought over a number of key issues, including control of the fur trade, territorial expansion, and the balance of power in North America. The French had strong alliances with various Native American tribes, and they fought alongside them against the British. But ultimately, the British were able to defeat the French and claim vast territories in North America. But while the British victory was decisive, it came at a cost. The war had been long and bloody, and the British were deeply in debt. To make matters worse, the war had left a power vacuum in North America. and the British were struggling to maintain order in their newly acquired territories. As a result, they began to impose more stringent policies on the colonies, which led to growing tensions between Britain and its American subjects. The French and Indian War was a pivotal moment in the history of colonial America. It marked the end of French influence in North America, and it led to the expansion of British territories. But it also led to the growing tensions that would eventually culminate in the American Revolution. The first was a royal colony. That's when the king directly controlled the colony. He appointed the governor and the upper house of the legislature. The lower house, though, was elected by property-owning men. That was like the Virginia Company. Then there was a proprietary colony. This is when the king granted a charter to some dude who then ran the colony like a business. Usually the owner of this colony would appoint the governor and the judges and stuff. And then finally, there was a corporate colony. You know how corporations are owned by shareholders? Well, in a corporate colony, a group of investors or shareholders were granted a charter by the king. They would then elect the governor and the assembly and stuff. And the most famous example of this was Massachusetts Bay. Now, despite the differences between these three types of colonies, they all had one thing in common. First, each had an assembly elected by landowning men. Now, we've already established that only white male property owners could vote. Sorry, women, Native Americans, black people, indentured servants, and criminals, but only white male property owners. Second, each colony had a governor, but the governor wasn't elected. The governor was appointed by either the king or the investor group or the shareholders, and this governor served at the pleasure of the king. Third, they all had courts to enforce the law. But really, the whole point of having an appointed judiciary was that they would be loyal to the king and not to the people. Now, if you answered agreement, then good job, because that is exactly right. In order for the British to rule over their North American colonies, they needed the consent of the governed, meaning the people had to agree to be ruled over by the British. And how did they show this consent? Through taxation. When the British Parliament passed a tax on the colonists, they were showing their consent to be ruled over by the British. And if they didn't pay the tax, it was assumed that they did not consent to be ruled over by the British and thus were traitors. The main reason for this was that the assemblies controlled the purse strings, meaning that they were the ones who voted on taxes and spending. And since no one likes to have someone else control their money, the assemblies got pretty powerful. For example, in 1710, the Assembly of Carolina passed a law saying that they would not allow any Anglican minister to be paid, unless the people of the parish said that they would pay his salary. What's interesting is that this was actually a law of the Church of England, but the Carolina Assembly nullified it. They were like, "We're not going to pay your ministers." And the governor couldn't do anything about it because the assembly controlled the money. Royal governors needed the approval of the assembly to do anything. If they didn't get the approval, then they couldn't raise an army or build a road or put out a fire. So yeah, the assemblies were getting pretty powerful, but they still couldn't break away from the mother country. Not yet. But after a while, you get tired of babysitting and you send your kids to summer camp and you hire a babysitter. But over time, Britain realized that enforcing all these laws would cost too much money, and they didn't get much in return. But don't get too excited yet, because it wasn't quite independence. They were still very much a part of the British Empire. They just had a lot of freedom, and this brings us to the second thing that helped the colonies become independent: the vast distance between Britain and the colonies. By the time a message was sent and received, events would have already happened and changed. It was almost impossible for the British government to control the colonies. And this brings us to the third thing that helped the colonies become independent: the Enlightenment. If you remember from Unit 2, Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke argued that all people are created equal, and that the purpose of government is to protect the natural rights of its citizens. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's probably because Thomas Jefferson lifted it straight from John Locke to write the Declaration of Independence. Anyway, These ideas inspired the colonists to think of themselves as a people separate from the king and the parliament. Why should the people of England get to tell them what to do? They were, after all, a separate people living in a distant land. Soon, the idea of self-rule and even independence began to take root in the minds of many. And this led to the fourth and final cause of independence, the acts of a frustrated people. You see, ever since the end of the French and Indian War, the British had been trying to tighten their control over the colonies and raise money to pay off their debt from the war. And the way they did this was through a series of acts and taxes. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, the Intolerable Acts. Each one of these acts and taxes enraged the colonists. They were not happy about being treated this way. They were not happy that the Parliament, which they had no voice in, was telling them what to do. They were not happy that they were being taxed without representation. So they began to take action against the British. They boycotted British goods. They formed groups to resist the taxes. They wrote pamphlets and newspapers to spread their ideas. They organized groups like the Sons of Liberty and the Committees of Correspondence. They even fought in the streets of Boston. And all of this caused the relationship between Britain and the colonies to break down. And eventually, on June 1776, the 13 colonies adopted the Declaration of Independence and became their own country. Okay, so imagine you're living in colonial America during the 1760s. Things are pretty chill. You live in one of Great Britain's 13 American colonies, and your life is pretty sweet. Your relationship with Britain is great. They don't really bother you, and you can make a lot of money with trade. However, there's the sense that things aren't going to stay like this forever. You just can't put your finger on it. What if I told you that the reason for this feeling was because in a few years' time, you and every single other colonist would be fighting for your very survival against the British Empire? And yes, we know where this story goes. The colonies become the United States. But what caused this change? Well, that's what we're here to find out. In this episode, we'll learn about the French and Indian War and how it helped cause the American Revolution. Now let's go back to 1754. In case you missed it, this is when the French and Indian War started. So named because the war was fought between the British and French empires and their respective Native American allies. The war would last 9 long years until 1763, and it wasn't only fought in North America, but also in Europe, India, and the Philippines. But don't worry, we'll focus mainly on North America. Now, despite being called the French and Indian War, the majority of the fighting wasn't done by Indians. Don't worry though, they kicked butt when they did fight. The war in North America was really about 2 things. First, both France and Britain wanted more land. And second, the British wanted to end French competition in the fur trade. The fur trade had been going on for decades, with the French having many trading posts throughout the Ohio Valley. But the British didn't like this situation. To see why, let us look at the North American colonies claimed by the French and British in 1754. As you can see, the French territory was mostly made up of these thin ribbons of land along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. The problem for the British was that this land was surrounded by colonies of the British. See, this was ungood for them, because all the interior of North America was open to settlement by the French or the various Native American tribes that sided with them. So, in 1754, the British dispatched young Major George Washington on a mission to tell the French to leave the Ohio Valley. But the French refused, so Washington attacked. This marked the beginning of the war. For the next several years, skirmishes were fought all across the Ohio Valley, with no side able to gain an advantage. It wasn't until 1757 that the tide of the war would turn. That year, the British sent over 2,000 troops to the New World under the command of General Edward Braddock. But Braddock's plan to capture the French city of Duquesne was thwarted, when he and most of his troops were killed by the French and Native Americans. George Washington, who served under Braddock, managed to escape and regroup. However, the British would not fare well in the war for the next several years. And it wasn't until 1760 that the British were finally able to capture Montreal, forcing the French to flee to Canada. The following year, in 1761, the British captured Havana, Cuba, from the Spanish, an important victory as it was a major port for trade between Europe and the Americas. Finally, in 1763, the war came to an end with the Treaty of Paris. With this treaty, the French officially gave up. They lost Canada and all lands east of the Mississippi to the British. Spain, who was allied with the French, got all the land north of the Mississippi and New Orleans. The Native Americans suffered the most. Their lands were taken by the British and they lost their allies, the French. Now, at first glance, it might seem like the war was a total loss for the French, but it wasn't. At the start of the war in 1754, the French colonies in North America were small and weak. Most of their population was in Europe, but after 9 years of fighting, their colonies were now much stronger. Thousands of European French soldiers had come to the New World to fight the British. When they left, many of them stayed. Also, thousands of French Canadians now lived in the southern colonies of Louisiana and Quebec. While these colonies were still weak, they were strong enough to survive and grow. For the British, the war was a great success. They grew their empire tremendously and now controlled all of North America except for Spain, Florida, and the 13 colonies, which were ruled by various proprietors and the crown. Yet, despite being victorious, the British were broke. The cost of maintaining a global empire was high, and now the British government was in debt. They needed a way to get money and fast. And they thought they knew just the place to look: their American colonies. From the beginning of the war, the British had borrowed money from the colonies to pay for the war effort. This amounted to about £50 million in today's money. But when the colonies heard that the war was over, they stopped lending money. When the British asked for the money back, the colonies refused unless they could first review and approve the new taxes that would be placed on them. The British Parliament rejected this proposal, insisting that they had the right to tax the colonies without representation. The Sugar Act of 1764 was the first tax passed to raise revenue in the colonies. This act taxed sugar and molasses imported into the colonies. Next was the Stamp Act, which taxed all paper goods such as newspapers, pamphlets, and playing cards. This act was very unpopular in the colonies. The British response was to pass the Quartering Act, which forced colonists to house British troops in their homes. Tensions rose, and colonists began to protest. Many boycotts and acts of defiance took place, including the famous Boston Tea Party. After this, the British passed even more acts to punish Massachusetts. The Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts, closed the port of Boston, revoked the Massachusetts Charter, and allowed British officials to be tried in Britain for crimes committed in the colonies. All of the colonies were outraged by these acts, and in 1774, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to discuss a unified response. Although no official break with Britain occurred, the road to revolution was now clear. The French and Indian War had caused the American Revolution. The war led to Britain taxing the colonies, which led to rebellion. It's a simple cause and effect. So, in conclusion, let's summarize everything. The French and Indian War lasted from 1754 to 1763 and was fought between the British and French empires and their Native American allies. The war was mainly about land and the fur trade. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, in which France gave up Canada and the Ohio Valley to the British. The war was costly for the British, and they needed to recoup some of the expenses. They decided to tax the American colonies. The colonists protested these taxes, and eventually the relationship between Britain and the colonies broke down. The war had caused the American Revolution. Okay, that's all for now. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button. We're really close to hitting 100,000 subscribers. It would mean a lot to me if you subscribed. Okay, thank you. Bye. Okay, so remember that whole thing we just spent like 24 videos talking about? Well, let's finish up this narrative with a nice little bow on top. So welcome to Unit 5, Part 4, The End of Colonial America. And as always, click the link above to grab a review packet if you want an A in your class and a 5 on your exam. Okay, so let's get right to it. So for this video, I'm going to consider the period between 1607 and 1763 as our colonial period, because by 1763, Great Britain issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which forbade settlement past a line which ran along the Appalachian Mountains. And that put a de facto end to the colonial period. So I'm going to leave everything after 1763 for another unit. So don't complain to me when I leave out the American Revolution. Okay, sorry, I'll stop getting distracted. Alright, here's what we're trying to do in this video. Explain how and why colonial America changed from a collection of struggling outposts to a thriving, complex society. Remember how all the first colonies were kind of duds? Yeah, well, things change. And then explain how the geographic, economic, and political characteristics of the colonies contributed to their eventual independence from Great Britain. In other words, how did the British come to lose all of their colonies in North America? Here we go. Okay, so let us begin with how the colonies developed over this period, and remember that development is really the operative word here. We're looking at how things changed. So let's start with the changes in population. Okay, so there are three types of people who came to the colonies during this period. First, you had the English settlers who began the process of migrating to the New World in significant numbers starting in the 1620s. Then second, you had indentured servants. These were people who sold their labor for a set number of years in exchange for passage to the New World. And lastly, you had enslaved Africans. Now remember that this was not a new phenomenon. Slavery and the slave trade had existed in Africa and the Americas since the 1500s. But during this period, the transatlantic slave trade became very lucrative, and thus the number of enslaved people coming to the Americas increased dramatically. Okay, so make sure you understand that these are three distinct groups, and they have different experiences in the colonies and eventually different roles in the Revolution. Okay, more on that in a minute. Then you need to know that cities grew. So we're talking about the rise of colonial cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. These became hubs of commerce and culture. But also you had the rise of new towns. I mean, remember, the colonial population went from around 2 million in 1700 to around 2.5 million in 1750. So yeah, a lot of people, plus all the land that became available due to the Royal Proclamation of 1763 led to the growth of towns. And then finally, colonial life became more complex. So think about how much simpler life was for the settlers of Jamestown in 1607 compared to the colonial citizens in 1750. They had far more access to consumer goods, better technology, greater specialization of labor. There was just more stuff. And in fact, even though rural life continued, colonial America had become more urban during this period. Okay, so now let's look at how this period saw the rise of a colonial identity. So earlier in colonial America, there was no real sense of unity among the colonies, but now there's growing sense of shared identity among the American colonists, and that's due to several factors. For one, the colonial legislatures met together in the early 1720s to address issues of common concern, things like trade with Native Americans, for example. Then secondly, the establishment of the colonial assemblies fostered a sense of self-government and unity among the colonies. Like Virginia established its House of Burgesses in 1619, and Massachusetts followed suit in 1629 with its General Court. And then lastly, communication and travel between the colonies became easier and more frequent. So all of this contributed to the creation of a distinct colonial culture. Like we're talking about the development of colonial arts and literature, the founding of colonial colleges like Harvard in 1636, the introduction of republicanism as a way of thinking. Remember what Alexis de Tocqueville said about this in the 1830s, He said that in America, Democratic and the Republican form of government were so interwoven that it seemed impossible to separate the two. It emphasized personal experience of faith. It promoted emotional expression in worship, and it encouraged active participation in religious life. And this had the effect of creating bonds across colonial lines. Okay, now let's talk about the contradiction of slavery. So we can't talk about the development of colonial life without addressing slavery. So make sure you understand the institution of slavery during this period. So firstly, it was a hereditary institution. In other words, if your parents were enslaved, then you were enslaved. Secondly, it was racialized. So remember, in the beginning, most of the laborers in the colonies were indentured servants, and those early colonies tried to enslave indigenous populations, but neither group proved very useful as a slave class. So then, the colonies turned to Africa as a source of slaves, and they developed the racist pseudoscience of scientific racism to justify their inhumane treatment of their new slaves. And then thirdly, slavery was linked to the plantation system in the southern colonies. So in the South, you had large plantations, growing cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. And all of that required lots of labor, which was provided by enslaved people. But then in the middle colonies, you had smaller farms, often owned by yeoman farmers, who supplemented their income by selling their labor at a shipyard or in a store. In other words, slavery existed in the North as well, but it was nearly as integral to the economy as it was in the South. Okay, now let us talk about how the colonial economy developed during this period, and remember that is key to understanding how the colonies gained independence. So first of all, the colonies developed a diverse economy. So we're talking about the triangular trade. This is the trading network between North America, Europe, and Africa that involved rum, slaves, and manufactured goods. And then secondly, the colonial economy was based on natural resources. I mean, each region had its specialty. The New England colonies focused on shipping, fishing, lumber, and small-scale manufacturing. The middle colonies were more like diversified agriculture. And then the southern colonies were all about cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. And then lastly, the colonial economy was closely tied to the economies of the West Indies and Great Britain. So as the Atlantic slave trade increased, the colonies became more dependent on the markets of the West Indies and Great Britain for their manufactured goods. And in order to acquire the money to buy those manufactured goods, the colonies specialized in producing raw materials to send to Great Britain. Okay, so then let us talk about how the colonies were governed during this period, and how that is connected to their eventual independence from Great Britain. So first of all, colonial governments adopted the English model. They established representative assemblies, bicameral legislatures, etc. But then secondly, as the period progressed, there was increasing tension between the colonies and the mother country over issues like trade, regulation, taxation, the French and Indian War, etc. And then finally, local self-government produced a new generation of American leaders who knew how to govern, and they resented British interference. I'm talking about people like Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, etc. All these guys got their start in local legislatures. And then we need to talk about the French and Indian War, because it was a disaster for Great Britain, and it set the stage for revolution in America. So first of all, the war was costly, and in an effort to pay for the war, Parliament passed a series of acts that raised revenue in the colonies, and that caused the colonists to cry tyranny, like the Sugar Act and the Currency Act, for example. Then secondly, after the war, the British issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which forbade settlement past a line along the Appalachian Mountains, and that restricted colonial expansion, and that caused resentment as well. And then lastly, the war devastated the colonial economy. The war disrupted colonial trade patterns. The cost of goods rose, and the colonies fell deeply into debt. Okay. So now let's finish by explaining how all these developments during the colonial period planted the seeds of revolution. And first of all, remember that the vast majority of the people in the colonies were not wealthy landowners. They were actually small farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, etc. And remember that many of them had come to North America intentionally to escape the rigid social hierarchy of European society. So it was not in their interest to have a government that imposed taxes without representation. Then, secondly, the idea of republicanism made its way to the colonies from Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, and that inspired revolutionaries with ideas like natural rights and the social contract, and the right to overthrow an oppressive government. And then lastly, remember that the revolutionary ideology spread first to the urban centers and then radiated outward. So you had artisans and merchants and laborers who were deeply affected by the economic policies of the British government. And then, as the ideology spread, you had small farmers who resented the loss of economic opportunities, and then yeoman farmers who were threatened by the expansion of slavery. And then finally, you had the backcountry and mountain men who were unaffected by British rule, and they welcomed the chance to be free. Click here if you need to review other topics in Unit 5, and subscribe if you want me to keep making these videos.